What do you do when everything is gone? When the job disappears, the marriage collapses, the phone goes silent, and all you're left with is your breath, your thoughts, and God. Most people would call it the end. But what if it's not? What if the greatest rebuild of your life begins right there, when the applause stops and the pain starts echoing louder than your prayers? This isn't just suffering, it's sacred territory. And if you're in it, you're not being punished, you're being positioned. Because when a man loses everything but still has God, something extraordinary happens. His priorities shift, his soul quiets, and in that quiet, heaven speaks. You don't need to be understood. You don't need to be celebrated. You need clarity, direction, strength. And those things don't come from the crowd, they come from the desert, from the stillness, from the God who never left. If you're here, it's because you're ready to stop performing and start transforming. There comes a moment when a man stops fighting the storm and simply lets the silence speak. No more messages to answer, no one left to impress, no title left to defend. The phone stops ringing, friends fade into memory, and all that remains is the muffled sound of your own heartbeat, echoing inside a room no one else walks into. But it's exactly there, in that forsaken territory, that something sacred begins to stir. The soul, once lost in the noise, finally pauses. And in that pause, what seemed like abandonment reveals itself as divine realignment. God never needed the noise to reach you. He was waiting for everything else to fall away so you could finally hear. It's strange to think that the path to prosperity might start not with motivation but with despair. Not in success but in surrender. But that's the truth most people never understand. It's in that quiet space where a man feels stripped of everything that he begins to be rebuilt with intention. As Napoleon Hill said, every adversity, every failure, every heartache carries with it the seed of an equal or greater benefit. That benefit often looks like clarity, like finally seeing what's real and what was just illusion. When the applause dies and the pressure to perform is gone, a man can finally meet himself and God in honesty. This is where invisible wealth begins its journey. Not in material possessions, but in clarity of vision, in emotional strength, in a sense of purpose that no applause or paycheck could ever provide. In the stillness, God speaks, not with noise, but with knowing. He whispers the kind of instructions that shape nations, businesses, legacies. Most people mistake this for a breakdown, but those who walk with God know better. This is excavation. This is the clean slate before the masterpiece. What the world sees as rock bottom, heaven calls foundation. And the man who accepts this process begins to build something the storm can't destroy. So if life has left you empty, good. Emptiness is not your enemy. It's the invitation to be filled with something eternal. When there's nothing left to cling to, your hands are finally free to receive what truly matters. Maybe this moment, right here, where you feel forgotten and cast aside, is actually the sacred space where your new path begins. What if the pain you're in isn't punishment, but a pause, a divine interruption? What if the silence around you is not a void, but a voice? God's voice, whispering in the language only suffering can translate. Let the world misinterpret your stillness. Let them walk away. They were never meant to hold your destiny. There's gold being formed in this quiet place. Real, lasting, inner prosperity begins when you stop running and start listening. The silence isn't the end, for it's the first word of a better beginning. And if you're still breathing, still standing, still listening, then hear this. You haven't been disqualified. You're not too broken. You're not too late. In fact, you're exactly where God does his best work, in the quiet with the raw materials of a humbled heart. You don't need an audience. You don't need approval. What you need is already within you, and the silence is proving it. This is not your downfall. It's your redefinition. The world may have stopped clapping, but heaven hasn't stopped moving. You are not forgotten, you are being redesigned. And what comes next will be greater than what you lost. No man wakes up one day prosperous by accident. Every story of abundance begins with a fire that was lit in the darkest moments. Pain doesn't just wound, it awakens. It strips away the superficial cravings and leaves behind a hunger that can't be ignored. When you're comfortable, you wish. But when you're desperate, you decide. The man who has nothing left to lose suddenly gains clarity. The loss, the rejection, the silent nights, they stop being obstacles and become fuel. Pain presses a man against the wall until he stops daydreaming and starts acting. That's what Napoleon Hill meant by burning desire. It's not ambition, it's not motivation. It's necessity wrapped in fire. When you cry out, "God, I can't live like this anymore," you're not being weak. You're entering a new level of power. This isn't about hustling harder. It's about reaching the core of your spirit, where your desire aligns so deeply with your purpose that no delay can stop you. The man who has walked through fire is no longer negotiating with life. He's claiming what is already his in the spirit. Many of the men who commented, "I lost my job, I have no one, I'm crying in my car," are closer to breakthrough than they realize. Because this is the territory where transformation begins. It's not in the blessing, it's in the breaking. The brokenness that empties you also makes room for something sacred to enter. The stronger your pain, the deeper your roots grow, and the deeper your roots, the higher your future can reach. Prosperity doesn't grow on the surface. It grows in men who bleed before they bloom. If you're in pain, don't waste it. Pain is currency in the invisible economy. It can be traded for purpose, clarity, depth, but only if you stop numbing it. Let it speak, let it teach, let it push you where comfort never could. The world taught you to run from pain, but the wise man listens to it. He knows that inside that ache is the seed of a new direction, a vision that refuses to die. Pain doesn't mean God abandoned you. It means He's inviting you to something greater. And maybe, just maybe, this pain is your preparation. Maybe the tears you shed in silence are watering something extraordinary. Maybe the nights that feel like endings are actually planting mornings you haven't seen yet. Because the most powerful men aren't the ones who avoided pain. They're the ones who used it as fuel. Let this be the season where your wounds become your weapons, where your brokenness becomes your breakthrough. When a man has no resources, no backup plan, and no applause, he is left with one question: do I still believe? Faith is not soft, it's not emotional fluff. It's spiritual equity, the only real currency when everything else has dried up. Faith is what you spend when you have nothing to give. It's the invisible down payment on a life you haven't seen yet, but already walk toward as if it were guaranteed. And that right there is the birthplace of every legacy that ever mattered. Think about it. Every man we admire in scripture and history had a moment when they believed before they saw. Abraham left everything with no GPS but a word. Joseph interpreted dreams in a dungeon before he wore a crown. They didn't wait for comfort to move. They moved because of conviction. Faith, at its core, is irrational to the world, but it's perfectly aligned with the logic of heaven. While others see a desert, a faithful man sees potential. While others see a delay, he sees divine preparation. Faith reframes everything. If you're in a season where nothing makes sense, and all you have is a whisper from God, you're in good company. That whisper might be your blueprint. That verse that won't leave your heart? It's the architecture of your next season. The voice that says, keep going even when you feel paralyzed. That's your compass. God doesn't hand out maps. He gives men missions, and missions are completed not by sight but by faith. The more invisible the path, the greater the foundation being laid. You don't need to see the full staircase, just the first step. And if you're afraid to take it, remember, the fear of the unknown is nothing compared to the pain of staying stuck. Faith says, even if I walk alone, I walk with purpose. Faith says, even if I lose everything, I haven't lost my calling. The world respects results. Heaven responds to faith. You don't need the applause of the crowd. What you need is the echo of God's promise in your chest. Because the man who walks by faith never walks alone. The silence might be deafening, the road might be empty, but heaven marches with him. One faithful step at a time becomes a journey, and one journey walked in faith becomes a legacy. So walk. Limp if you must, crawl if you have to, but don't stand still. God funds the faith-filled. And this walk of faith, it's building the wealth no bank can hold, but that every generation to come will inherit. Every man called to something great will first be led into a desert. Not a literal one, but a place where comfort dies, noise fades, and you're left face to face with yourself. No filters, no feedback, just the real you and God. The desert doesn't break men, it reveals them. It strips the ego and shows you what's still holding you back from becoming who you were born to be. Prosperity, real prosperity, doesn't start in palaces. It's carved in caves. Moses wasn't ready to lead a nation until he lived as a fugitive in the wilderness. David didn't sit on a throne until he first hid in caves, crying out through psalms. Jesus began his ministry only after 40 days of hunger, isolation, and temptation in the desert. These weren't delays, they were design. The wilderness is not a punishment, it's a process. And the man who dares to stay faithful there, he's the one God trusts with kingdoms. The desert teaches what the crowd never will: patience, purity of motive, and spiritual authority. There are no shortcuts here, no applause, no distractions, but also no competition. This is where God molds leaders in secret so they can rise in public with power. If you find yourself there, don't panic. Don't despise it. You've been enrolled in a divine academy, one that has graduated kings, prophets, and visionaries. And in this academy, silence is your syllabus. Stillness is your assignment. You'll learn to lead not by commanding, but by listening. You'll understand that influence is not given by men, but by heaven. Every dry season, every unanswered prayer, every long night is shaping something eternal in you. You're not being delayed, you're being deepened. And what God deepens, He always intends to elevate. There comes a moment when your strength gives out, and something greater takes over. That something is grace, but not the version people talk about casually, not a soft, sentimental idea. No, this grace is fierce. This grace lifts a man off the floor when willpower has failed. It holds him together when the pieces won't. It doesn't just console, it commissions. God's grace isn't just about getting through hard times, it's about what you're going to build because of them. When Paul cried out for relief from his thorn, God didn't remove the pain, He revealed the power. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. That's not just scripture, that's architecture for a new life. When your plans collapse and your heart breaks, grace comes in, not to fix what was, but to start something that never existed before. It's in that raw, humbled state that God begins His real work, the rebuilding of a man from the inside out. And here's the truth most people miss. Prosperity isn't about what you get, it's about what you carry. And grace turns broken men into carriers of purpose, wisdom, clarity. A man who receives grace walks differently. He's not loud, but he's unshakable. He doesn't need applause, but he moves with quiet authority. Why? Because grace trained him in silence, strengthened him in suffering, and equipped him for a mission only he could fulfill. So if you're at your limit, Don't ask for escape. Ask for grace. Say it out loud, even if your voice is shaking. God is making me stronger. Let that truth echo in your mind and comment it below. Let it be your anchor, because once grace enters the scene, defeat is no longer an option. You are no longer the same man. You are being rebuilt for something divine. The man who accepts grace doesn't just recover, he reinvents. He doesn't just survive, he creates. He doesn't just heal, he leads. One day he'll look back on the wreckage and realize it wasn't a grave, it was a blueprint. What tried to bury him actually planted him. And now, with every scar turned into strategy, every wound transformed into wisdom, he rises. Not with pride, but with purpose. Not to prove something, but to fulfill something. Real transformation doesn't begin with motivation. It begins with surrender. The moment a man stops clinging to who he thought he had to be, he becomes available to who God designed him to be. Ego is loud. It resists correction, avoids silence, and needs validation. But in the breaking, the ego gets quiet. When there's no one left to impress and no image left to protect, a new kind of strength begins to rise, one not built on pride but on truth. This is where real men are formed. Not in the glow of applause, but in the dark moments when everything false is stripped away. When a man lets go of the need to control, explain, or prove himself, he discovers a new power, freedom. Freedom to listen, freedom to grow, freedom to be led. In that posture of humility, God begins to rebuild him from the inside out, with a foundation that doesn't crack under pressure. There's a reason the proud fall and the humble rise. Ego builds castles on sand. Humility builds fortresses on rock. The man who dies to his ego doesn't lose himself. He meets himself. He finds the version of him that was hidden under years of noise, fear, and false identity. And that version? He's clear, focused, and dangerous in the best way. Because nothing can stop a man who has nothing left to prove. That's why God doesn't bless masks. He blesses truth. And the man willing to shed his titles, detach from opinions, and lay down the fear of looking weak. That is the man God can trust with influence, wealth, and legacy. Not because he's perfect, but because he's finally real. What breaks your ego isn't the enemy, it's the entry point of grace. So if life has broken your pride, good. That was never meant to carry you. Let humility take over. Let silence be your teacher, because the man who kneels in surrender will soon rise in strength. And when he rises, he won't be reaching for validation. He'll be walking in vision. There comes a moment when the shift happens, not outside, but within. The storm may still rage, the bank account might still be low, but something inside the man has changed. He speaks slower but with more weight. He listens deeper. He moves with purpose, no longer needing to prove his worth. This is inner prosperity, the kind that can't be taxed, touched, or taken. It's the wealth that begins in the mind, settles in the heart, and flows through every decision. And once it's there, the world feels it, even if it can't explain it. You see it in his eyes. A calm that doesn't come from ease, but from endurance. A peace born not from having less problems, but from carrying a different power. That power is clarity. The man who has been through fire no longer fears the heat. He knows what matters. He knows who he is. He's not distracted. He's not shaken. He's not reactive. That's the kind of man who becomes a magnet for opportunity, not because he's chasing, but because he's aligned. When God reconstructs a man from the inside, everything around him eventually begins to respond. Doors open, ideas flow, people listen. Why? Because prosperity always starts invisible, first in the belief, then in the behavior, then in the results. This is not magic, it's spiritual law. What you cultivate in solitude will echo in your surroundings. What you build in silence will speak for you in public. But don't be fooled. This inner wealth isn't loud. It doesn't brag. It just is. It brings peace into tension, direction into confusion, stability into chaos. People start to ask, what happened to you? And you won't have to explain because your presence will carry the answer. That's prosperity. That's divine residue from time spent with God, alone, broken, healed, and now walking whole. The man who once cried out in silence is now a source of strength for others. His scars aren't shame, they're signals. His story isn't a tragedy, it's a roadmap. And everything the world said disqualified him has become the exact reason he's qualified to lead. He doesn't just talk about transformation, he embodies it. This is when the invisible becomes undeniable. This is when God gets the glory. The greatest proof that a man has truly changed isn't what he gains, it's what he gives. The wealth that heaven deposits in secret was never meant to stay hidden. The man who's been rebuilt by grace, refined by pain, and reshaped by solitude now walks the earth differently. He doesn't need a spotlight because his life has become the message. He doesn't preach change. He is change. And without even trying, his story becomes oxygen to those still gasping in the fire. This is where legacy begins, not in assets or applause, but in impact. You carry peace into rooms because you paid for it in silence. You speak life into broken people because you've been shattered and healed. You offer direction because you once wandered lost. Nothing is wasted. Every tear, every setback, every unanswered prayer. They were all tools in God's hands to build the man you've now become. And now it's your turn to give back from what you've been given. You don't need a title to lead. You don't need a pulpit to preach. The life you live is the platform. The decisions you make in the quiet now echo in the lives of others. That is prosperity, not measured by luxury, but by legacy, not stored in a vault, but seeded into generations. When you overflow from grace, you shift atmospheres. You become a walking reminder that God is still writing redemptive stories, and the beauty of it all, you're just getting started. What you thought was an ending was merely the setup for influence you couldn't have handled before. Now that your ego is gone, your mission is clear. Now that your heart has healed, your hands can help. This is the season of overflow, not just to survive, but to multiply. The grace that lifted you is now the grace that flows through you. So walk boldly, love deeply, speak gently, carry peace like armor. Because your life is not just yours anymore, it's an answer to someone else's prayer. You're not just a man who was broken and rebuilt. You are a vessel of strength, clarity, and vision. And from now on, every room you enter will feel it, even before you speak. You were never meant to stay in that valley. It was only the classroom. Now it's time to walk, not as the man who broke, but as the one who rebuilt. The silence didn't mean God left you. It meant he was working in deeper ways. And now you're not just surviving, you're aligned. You've seen what the world can take, but you've also seen what heaven can build. If this message found you, don't stop here. There's another video waiting for you right now, appearing on your screen, meant to take you even deeper into the mysteries of your mind, your spirit, and your purpose. Click, watch, and let your transformation continue. Because this journey of understanding how to prosper from the inside out is only just beginning.